Welcome, everyone, to our July forum. This is our third webinar on our Good Intentions series. My name is Catherine, and I am delighted to be with you here today. So before we dive in, a very brief word about who we are. Faith Invest, we are a UK-based charity organization. We support faith organizations all around the world to align their investments with their faith values. We work across faith traditions and we work across geographies. And my colleague Pippa is just going to add our disclaimer to the chat. This is our third webinar in our Good Intentions series. Good Intentions 2026 is Faith Invest's most comprehensive research project to date. As part of this project, we analysed 275 publicly available investment policies from faith organisations from around the world, assessing each of those policies against our 10 criteria that together make up our faith consistent investing framework. These criteria cover everything from how clearly a policy articulates our faith values, through to how organizations govern investment decisions, communicate with their communities, and build the expertise that they need. The full report is available to download free of charge from our website. I think Pippa, my colleague, is very kindly putting the link to that report in the chat. As mentioned, this is our third series. In June, we looked at the 4 foundational criteria. So we looked at faith documentation, ethical exclusions, positive screening, and investment vehicle selection. So in other words, what your policy says you believe, what you will not invest in, what you want to support, and whether your funds can actually deliver on these commitments. Today, we are going to turn to a different and in many ways a harder set of questions. Who in your organization is responsible for making sure your investments reflect your values, whether they have what they need to do that well, and how you communicate your approach to the people that you serve, to your members, your followers, your faith community. Please engage with us throughout this forum by using the chat function. Add your comments, your questions in the chat so that we can address these at the end of the session. So as a reminder, each criterion in Good Intentions 2026 is scored on a scale of 0 to 5. That gave a total score out of 50. And that total score placed an organization into one of 4 tiers. So from minimal implementation of faith consistent investing right through to outstanding alignment. Today, we're looking at just three of the criteria. The first that we're going to look at is governance and decision making. And it's worth saying clearly what this means, what governance means, because it can sound a little bit technical. So governance simply means who makes decisions within the organization around investments, how they make them, and who checks that things are going the right way. So in investment terms, it's your trustee board, your finance committee, or whoever has responsibility for your assets within your organization. The question that this criterion asks is a simple one. When those people sit down to make investment decisions, is faith part of the conversation? Not just in who they are, so whether it's a Methodist committee or a Catholic board, but in what they actually examine and decide. So are they asking, does this portfolio reflect our values? Or are they mainly asking, is this performing well and managing risk appropriately? Both of these questions matter, but for a faith organization, the first question should never be missing from the room. Just a side note, we have published on governance in the past. In 2024, we published on governance and faith consistent investing with NEPC. And I think Pip is going to put a link to that paper in the chat as well. The second criterion that we're looking at today is also is stakeholder communication and accountability. So this asks whether your community, your congregation, your members, the people that you serve knows how you invest and why. So it's about transparency and accountability, not just reporting upwards to boards, for example, but communicating outward to the people your organization exists to serve. And then the third that we're going to look at is education and expertise. So this asks whether the people responsible for investment decisions, the trustees, committee members, treasurers, bursars, actually have the knowledge they need to make faith-consistent investing decisions well. So it's not just about financial expertise, which is well covered. It's about whether anyone is equipping them specifically for faith-consistent investing. So we'll walk through what good intentions found on each of these three. And then I'm going to turn to our executive chair, Dave Zellner, who, as you know, also co-authored Good Intentions. We then open it up to questions. So let's get started. So here's where these three criteria sit relative to the other 7 that we've looked at. So governance scored 2.9 out of 5, the highest of all 10 criteria. Stakeholder communication scored 2.2, and education and expertise scored just 1.4. That was the lowest of any criteria in the entire data set of 275 policies that we assessed. And that spread is quite revealing. So governance, the structures that faith organizations put in place, is actually the strongest area overall. But as we'll see, having a structure is not the same as having a faith integrated process. And the moment you move from structure to capability, to whether the people inside that structure are equipped and whether anyone outside that structure is told what's happening, that picture changes considerably. So let's just look a little bit in more detail at governance. So in Criterion 5, we asked, is faith actively shaping how investment decisions are made? Not just who's around the table, but what they actually do. So as we saw on the previous slide, this is the strongest criteria in the entire study. 71% of the organizations that we looked at scored 3 or above. On the surface, that's quite encouraging. Most faith organizations have some form of investment governance in place. But when we look more closely, a different picture emerges. So the structure was religious, the organization, for example, maybe a church or a diocese, but the process inside that structure was often secular. So the committees reviewed performance and risk without a formal step that also asked, does this portfolio actually reflect our faith teaching? Faith was present in who was in the room, but not in what the room examined. So many organizations, in other words, have faith-based governance in name, but not fully in practice. So what can faith organizations actually do about this? And especially the smaller organizations that we often work quite closely with, and who may have limited capacity and time and resources. The most important step can often be the simplest. So adding faith alignment as a standing agenda item at your investment committee meeting doesn't have to be a lengthy discussion. Even one question at each meeting makes a difference. Something like, is there anything in our current portfolio or in any decision we are being asked to make today that we need to consider through the lens of our faith values? Then that single question can change the culture of how an investment committee operates. For organizations with denominational investment bodies, a second step could be to formally require any new investment vehicle for it to be assessed for alignment with denominational guidance before it is approved. Again, doesn't necessarily require specialist expertise, but it does require a process. And then for smaller organizations that feel this is beyond their capacity, you don't necessarily need a dedicated investment committee to do this well. Even a finance subcommittee that includes one trustee with a specific remit to consider faith alignment and who is given access to your faith or denominational guidance and resources, for example, can make a difference. Let's look at stakeholder communications then. So this was criterion 6 in our good intentions. And criterion 6 asks, does your community, so does your faith community, know how and why you invest the way you do? So 68% of the organizations that we looked at scored 2 or below, and only around 3% had anything approaching systemic reporting on their exclusions, their engagement, or their proxy voting, for example, to their wider community. So reporting overwhelmingly flows upwards to boards, the finance committees, regulators, but it rarely flows outwards to the congregations, the members, the communities within faith organizations. So the values alignment work is being done, but it stays inside the governance structure. And this is not just a missed communications opportunity, it's a missed opportunity for accountability and trust. And for smaller faith organizations, for example, it's a missed opportunity, or well, for all organizations, regardless of size, it's a missed opportunity to demonstrate to your community that your assets are being managed in a way that reflects who you are as an organization. So, what can organizations practically do? The highest value step is also one of the most accessible. So, publish your investment policy, put it on your website, or include a summary in your annual report. Most organizations that have developed a policy never make it public, and yet making it visible is itself can be a form of trust building, accountability that strengthens how that policy is implemented. The second step is to produce a brief, a plain language summary of your investment approach, perhaps once a year. It doesn't have to be a technical report, but even a short statement that your congregation or membership can actually read and understand. Something that says, here is what we invest in, here is what we avoid, here is why, here is how it connects to our faith. 2 pages, for example. And for smaller organizations, this could simply be a paragraph in your annual review or even a section in your newsletter. The third step, and this is particularly powerful, is to create a space for your community to ask questions about your investments. Organizations that open that conversation may find that their communities are more engaged, perhaps more supportive than they expected. Let's look at our final criterion then for today. This is criterion 7 in good intentions, and this is education and expertise. So criterion 7 asked, do those responsible for investment decisions actually have what they need to make those decisions well? So this was the lowest scoring criterion in the entire study, just 1.4 out of 5. So committees are routinely expected to oversee investment consistent investing, faith consistent investing, without being equipped to interpret what it actually means in practice. So fiduciary training is common and often required, but faith consistent investing training is almost never required and rarely offered. So no single faith tradition has meaningfully solved this. For smaller organizations, again, many organizations that we work with, this gap can feel particularly acute. So you may have one finance volunteer, you may have a part-time treasurer or a small trustee board, where no one has a background in investments. And yet you are expected to make, or at least oversee, decisions about how significant assets are managed. The most important thing we can say here is You don't need to become an investment expert. What you do need to know is what questions you should ask. And there are a small number of questions that go a long way. And again, we've published on this topic. Pippa's going to drop a link again in the chat, just pointing to some questions that you might find helpful. Again, another plug for what we do. Education is a big aspect of our work here in Faith Invest, and building that confidence around faith consistent investing is the core of that educational focus. I think it's important to emphasize here that these questions do not necessarily require kind of a specialist knowledge to ask. And the quality of the answers you receive will tell you a great deal about whether your current arrangements are fit for purpose. So beyond individual questions, there are three things that any committee can realistically do to build capability. So first, for example, orient new trustees and committee members specifically in faith consistent investing, not just in general financial governance. So a 1 hour session at the start of someone's tenure can make a big difference. Second, make your denominational investment guidance required reading for anyone with investment oversight responsibility. So most denominations have produced guidance that very few of their own committees may have actually read. Third, then engage with peer networks, engage with organizations such as Faith Invest, and engage with other faith organizations that are facing the same questions. Attending here today is a perfect example of how you can engage, and sharing with others that have learned is probably one of the most practical forms of education available to organizations, irrespective of size. So, what do these three criteria tell us? There's a governance gap. Most organizations have faith-based structures, but the investment decision-making process inside them is largely secular. There's a communication gap. Values alignment work is being done, but it often stays inside governance structures and rarely reaches the people that faith organizations exist to serve. And then there's an expertise gap. So trustees are expected to oversee faith consistent investing without being equipped to understand or interrogate it. And that's the lowest score of all 10 criteria. We like to make it clear that, and certainly from the good intentions research, that it's not a lack of commitment or intent. So faith commitment, a commitment to faith consistent investing is not the problem here. Rather, it's gaps in the infrastructure, the ecosystem, and the support that are available to assist faith organizations on this journey. I'm going to break things up now a little bit. We do have two polls. So the first poll is only for the faith organizations in the room. So only answer this question if you are joining us from a faith organization. So the question is, how does your organization ensure that your investments reflect your tradition's faith values? Okay, very encouraging. So 62% of you said your policy clearly defines a process for ensuring faith values. Fantastic. 23%, we inform our asset managers of our faith beliefs and ask that they make a good faith effort to adhere to them. 8% don't know, 8% don't have a formal policy. Okay, so we now have another poll. So poll 2 is only for those of you working in the professionally in investments. So our asset managers, our advisors, consultants, for example, that are in the room. This one is for you. When you work with faith-based clients, how do you approach governance, trustee education, and stakeholder communication? And we do have a don't know option as well. Just wait for the responses. Okay. Okay, 40% of you lead on it. We proactively raise all three as part of our service. Just under a third of you, we respond. We engage when the client raises it or when an issue makes it necessary. 20% we cover it. I'm glad to see that none of you say that you stay out of it. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'm now going to turn to Dave Zellner. Dave is our executive chair and the co-author in Good Intentions 2026. Dave, I have some questions for you. Good Intentions, as we all know, assessed 275 policies across a sector that stewards trillions, and not one of those policies achieved full alignment, full faith consistent investing. So you've spent nearly 3 decades running a denominational fund that smaller institutions leaned on. When you look at these results, what rings most true, and where do you think the real gap sits between what organizations believe and then what they actually do?
Thanks, Catherine, and hello, everyone. It's good to be with you again for our Good Intentions, our third in our series on Good Intention webinars. So, faith-based asset owners, they almost universally appoint seasoned investment and financial professionals to their boards and committees, and that's the right instinct. But many, though certainly not all, the professionals that they appoint to their boards have this inherent bias against anything that limits the investment universe through exclusions or that directs capital towards something that has a positive purpose. They've been trained to believe that negative screening and positive investment don't align with sound fiduciary duty to maximize risk-adjusted returns. So that gap really isn't about values. Nearly every organization has those, but the gap opens at the committee table where well-intentioned faith commitments meet a professional reflex that treats them as a constraint on performance rather than a legitimate part of their mandate. And in that reflex, it rests on a misconception, one where addressing systemic risks like climate and inequality can show that investing consistent with faith beliefs can actually strengthen returns over the horizons that matter most to institutions that aspire to exist in perpetuity. So until that myth is challenged directly, the gap between belief and practice will continue to persist.
So let's talk about governance. Governance was the strongest scoring area, yet Good Intentions describes a pattern it calls structural faith. So religious organizations running a secular governance process. For a trustee here today who perhaps recognizes their own committee in that, what does it take to move from a faith-based structure to a genuinely faith integrated one without having to rebuild governance from scratch?
So the phrase structural faith captures something that we saw repeatedly when we were doing these assessments. That organizations, they all have the right elements, but there's a faith-based mission, a committee of believers, a policy that opens with a statement of values. But when the committee meets, it's really all that different. It's not all that different from secular investment committees. They focus on performance against benchmarks, they review their managers, and they review their asset allocation. Now, all those things are really important. Faith is in the room, but it's assumed rather than being closely examined. Moving to faith integrated processes doesn't require rebuilding governance from scratch. It just requires a few deliberate changes to how the committee actually works. So there are three things. The first one is that the committee needs to make sure that they include faith on the agenda as a standing item, something that will get intentionally discussed. Every quarter or whenever the committee meets, Someone, and I think it should be the chair, should ask explicitly, where do our values show up in the decisions we made this period, and where didn't they? Second is to change the questions you ask your asset managers. Most committees will always ask the question, how did we perform and why did we perform that way? And then they'll add, how did this portfolio reflect what we say we stand for? When committees simply ask this question, when they add the question, how did this portfolio reflect what we say we stand for? Then behavior starts to shift for both the asset owner and their asset managers. Third, build in a moment of discernment. Many traditions have practices for this. Before the committee makes any significant investment decision, what they'll do is they'll ask the question, does this decision align or does it not align with our tradition and our values? This shouldn't be just a check the box item, but a moment of genuine reflection. None of these three steps require a new committee or an overhaul of the whole governance process. The structure is already there in most organizations, but what's missing is the intentional habit of using those three steps.
Excellent. Thank you, Dave. Good intentions. We also found that many smaller faith organizations they can't fully invest in line with their own commitments simply because the available pool fund options don't allow it. So, how should a committee approach that dilemma? What can like a treasurer or a burster realistically do to push for better alignment from their pooled fund managers?
Yeah, that's a challenge and one
Mm,
that really hits smaller organizations the hardest. What they've done is they've crafted a policy. That policy
mm,
clearly defines what they want to exclude. But then when you look at the pooled funds that are available to invest in, they hold securities and companies that your policy is committed to avoid. And so for a
mm,
smaller asset owner, separate accounts with custom screenings usually just isn't possible because of scale.
mm,
So the policy will say one thing, but then when they look at their investments, it says something completely different. So
mm,
it's not that there's a lack of commitment, but it's just the practical lack of options. So
mhm,
I'd
mhm,
say two things to a committee in that position.
mm,
First, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
mm,
You may not be able to get a fully bespoke solution, but you have more leverage than you think. Use your voice, not just your wallet.
mm,
And second, here's what a treasurer or bursar can realistically do. Ask your manager directly, what screening can you apply to our holdings and what would it cost? When you ask those questions, you'll find more flexibility than you originally thought was possible.
mm,
You can also ask, what are the engagement practices and what are the proxy voting policies? And to what extent are those
mm,
proxies voted in line with your priorities?
mm,
You can also ask whether there are faith-aligned or screened share classes that
mhm,
exist.
mhm,
And if you're
mhm,
not happy with the answers, just ask the important question of all.
mm,
What would it take for you to offer something that we need, something that we're
mm,
looking for? Because if your
mm,
advisor or asset manager has other faith-based clients,
mm,
those other clients are likely asking the same questions. And you
mm,
know what they say about the squeaky wheel. So this last point matters. Faith-based
mm,
investors collectively represent an enormous amount of assets. And although small organizations often feel powerless,
mm,
that demand is real and it's growing.
mm,
And asset managers respond to demand. Every committee that asks these questions
mm,
makes it easier for the next one to get a better answer.
mhm, mhm. So I'm going to jump to communication. Um, Good intentions describes a values communication void. So only around 3% of organizations report systemically on how their investments reflect their values. And what reporting exists, as I've already mentioned, tends to go up to boards rather than out to congregations. So beyond it being good PR, why does closing this gap matter? And what does honest, accessible communication look like for an organization quietly doing good work, but maybe not telling anyone?
Yeah, like you said, only 3% of the organizations we assess systematically report to their stakeholders on how their investments reflect their values. Just 3%.
Mm,
And where that reporting exists, like you said, Catherine, earlier, it flows upwards to boards and finance committees rather than downward to the congregations and the lay members who donated those funds,
mm,
or any others who have a vested interest in how the institution invests the money. So for example, pensioners and employees that are
mm,
that the funds are invested to support benefits.
mm,
That's the values communication void. And
mm,
so why does this matter beyond just good PR? There are three reasons. The first is accountability. If you don't report on how your investments reflect your values, there's nothing that's really holding you to the commitment.
mm,
Reporting creates discipline, and
mm,
what gets measured and communicated gets done.
mm,
Second, and probably the most important, is
mm,
trust.
mm, mm.
The people, your stakeholders, the people in the pews, your members, your donors, others that have a vested interest, they assume the institution's money reflects the institution's beliefs.
Mm,
Honest communications, including about where you're failing,
mm,
builds far more trust than just silence on
mm,
or a glossy success story.
mm,
And then third, and this is the one that's often missed, it's a witness. If a
mm.
faith-based organization is quietly doing good work with its capital and never tells anyone,
Mm,
it forfeits the demonstration effect. Part
mm.
of the point of faith-consistent investing is to show others that it can be done and it can be
Yes.
done successfully. Silence just wastes that.
Yeah.
So what does honest communication looks like? It doesn't mean a 100-page report. It means telling your community in plain language what you've chosen to avoid,
Yeah.
what you've chosen to support, and why and how it connects explicitly to your tradition's teaching. You should be honest about the gaps and what you're doing about them, and do that on a regular cadence. Accessible, honest, and regular. That's the standard.
Thanks, Dave. I have a closing question. So, if every trustee, treasurer, bursar in the room changed just one thing after today, what would you want it to be?
So if I could get every trustee, treasurer, and bursar in the room to change just one thing, it would be this. Start asking your managers and advisors one new question at every meeting. How does this portfolio reflect what our faith tradition stands for? How does this portfolio reflect what our faith tradition says it stands for? It sounds small, but that single question does a lot of work. It signals to your manager that your values are a part of the mandate, not a footnote. It services gaps you didn't know you had. It forces the committee to state what the tradition actually teaches. And it begins almost on its own to close the distance between what you believe and what your money actually does. You don't have to rewrite your investment policy tomorrow or make major changes to your governance structure. Just start consistently asking that question and make it on record. Everything else will follow from that.
Thanks, Dave. So, I see we have just two, maybe three questions in the chat. The first one, Should This is from Jacques. Should not circular-based investment practice streamline the faith alignment or be inclusive in that sense? And number two, what true benefit to recipients should it be? That the meaning of that question is not entirely clear to me. I'm not sure if it's clear to you, Dave. So Jacques, if you want to maybe just rephrase the question, so that I could be a little bit clearer about what you mean and if it relates to one of the criterion that we're looking at here today. Um, Azay, and apologies if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. I will cover your question in our last slide. We have a question. Julie also wants to put a question in the chat, so feel free to type that in, Julie, and then we can answer it. I don't think there is also a question. So we tend to keep the answers to questions and the questions specifically to faith consistent investing. So we try to keep them on topic. So just while I am waiting for Julie to put her question in the chat box, we can tell you a little bit about what we can do if you want to take the next step. Um, so yeah, the question, would it be possible to share the slides? So just to say, if you've registered for today, you will receive a copy of the slides after this call. So at some point, um, I just see, yeah, I'm just keeping an eye on the chat here. So I was asking if Dave can put the question. Okay, yeah. So Julie was asking if Dave can put the questions that he suggests in the chat. Yeah, thank you for that, Julie. What we can do is we can in the follow-up to this forum, we can include the questions and the kind of practical guidance to each of these criteria in the follow-up email. So just bear with us. We'll get them documented so that you can use them and apply them. Jacques, should the investment practice be inclusive? And point two, what true return to the recipients should it be? And I think that probably relates to governance and communication. Dave, do you want to just make a comment in relation to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to be answering the question, but I'll give it a shot, Catherine. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about regarding communication.
Hmm.
To the extent that an organization, a faith-based asset owner, is communicating with its stakeholders and actually reaching out and getting feedback, that can inform, and I know we did this at Westpath, we regularly would bring in members of our stakeholder group
Hmm.
to inform them of our investment practices and actually to get their feedback on things that they would like to see. I remember one of the things that we used to do is we would bring together a number of young leaders. We called it the
Hmm.
Y Lab, young leaders as I can't remember exactly what it stands for. But we would bring in young leaders and we would sit down with them and we talk about our investment practices and we would get their feedback. And it actually led to improvements in our investment practices. So that's one action that someone can take if they want to ensure that their investment policies and practices are more inclusive.
Excellent. Thank you, Dave. And I know in the past here in Faith Invest, we've cited the Church of Sweden as being a particularly good example of inclusive, transparent, honest, open communication. There's another question. How faith investment can help, and in what ways can we convince our young leaders to invest their capacity in faith consistent investing? I think, I mean, what we've mentioned here today, I think the role of communication, communicating with your members, communicating with your followers is perhaps a one way of, convincing, encouraging, motivating, and enabling all members of the faith community, whether it's young leaders, to be more interested and engaged within the faith consistent journey of the organization. So I'm conscious of time. Again, may want to know next steps. If anything in today's conversation has made you wonder how your own organization's governance, communications, or trustee expertise measures up, you can get a formal assessment through Faith Invest, and this is free, confidential to faith-based organizations. So, as part of this assessment process, we evaluate your policy against the good intentions criteria, and then we give you a clear roadmap, a clear, accessible roadmap for strengthening your policy. You can start by scanning the QR code on your screen or going to faithinvest.org/IPG assessment. Or if you'd like to talk it through first, feel free to drop us an email at info@faithinvest.org. This is the third in our series of forums on the good intentions findings. In September, so early September, we will explore professional guidance, regular review, monitoring, and continuous improvement. So these are the three remaining criteria of good intentions, and the details are on the screen. Again, QR code for registration. We also have our Faith and AI webinar later this month. Registration is open, so please scan the QR code and register your place. We will be looking at how to navigate AI within, or artificial intelligence, so AI within the context of faith consistent investing, and we do have more details coming soon on that. As always, please keep an eye on our website at faithinvest.org for more information. And finally, thank you, of course, to Dave for such a thoughtful and generous conversation. And of course, thank you to all of you for joining us and for being with us today. We will be sure to circulate the slides and those questions and tips that we discussed with Dave over the coming days. And we look forward to seeing you later in the month. Thank you.